Well, folks, I'd like to welcome you to the Digital Transformation in Government afternoon session. We've got two very interesting presentations from academia, followed by the Office of the Auditor General, and then the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity and Communication Security Establishment. Joining us today and presenting at this point in time is Timothy Lethbridge. Dr. Lethbridge is Vice Dean of Governance at the University of Ottawa, and he's going to provide, his presentation is going to be entitled Perspectives from Over 80 International Enterprise Architects on What Constitutes Success, Principles, and Agility, and that'll build on a great deal of what was presented this morning. Tim Lethbridge has been a full-time faculty member at the University of Ottawa since 1994. He started his career in the Data Processing Division of the Government of New Brunswick in the early 1980s. He received his Master's of Computer Science from the University of New Brunswick in 1987, and then worked for Bell Northern Research. He received his PhD on the topic of knowledge management in 1994. His research and his teaching has focused on software engineering, software tools usability, the UMPO methodology, and enterprise architecture. Well, without further ado, we are privileged to have Dr. Lethbridge present. Thank you very much for the to present, Tim, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Bob. Welcome to everybody. I've been enjoying this conference very much so far this week. The work I'm presenting today was done in large part by a PhD student of mine who graduated a year ago, Aliaa Alghamdi. She is currently a professor in Saudi Arabia, and unfortunately, due to timing constraints, was not able to be with us today. I did ask her. All right, so the goal of our work has been to focus on higher education institutions as a public sector type of institution of interest. Our expectation is that the work, however, could be generalized to other types of public sector institutions. And our objective is to try and improve enterprise architecture in such institutions in order to allow universities, particularly, to manage resources better, make better decisions, and ultimately give our clients, who are the students, better education and experience, all the while embracing agility and innovation. So the research method was two-pronged. The first thing we did was we performed what's called grounded theory. Essentially, this involves doing interviews with practitioners. So we did lengthy interviews with 21 practitioners in 6 countries, you can see listed there. Interviews ranged from 40 minutes to, in one case, almost 2 hours. We tried to make them shorter, but sometimes these enterprise architects were really, really keen to keep talking. So that was okay. We then transcribed and coded, which is a form of analysis of what was said so that we could understand in detail the themes and issues they brought up. And then we took the output of that and we created an in-depth survey. So that was step 2. And we conducted this survey in the spring of 2019. And I'm going to present the results of that survey today, as informed by the original interviews. So in order to conduct the survey, we sent out invitations to enterprise architects or people who we perceived as being able to connect us with the enterprise architecture function in 229 institutions in countries throughout the world. And in the end, we had a 30.5% response rate, which is actually considered quite good when you cold call people. We did some of this by phoning, some of this by email. People seem to be very interested in giving their perspective on enterprise architecture. So that was very heartening. We also used some mailing lists. So for example, in Australia and New Zealand, we contacted the Cordit mailing list. That's a group of IT enterprise architecture people in Oceania. After this, reaching out to these people, we received 115 responses, but we couldn't use all the responses. There was a variety of reasons. 70 of the responses were what we would call complete. A little bit over 80 were usable, but 70 were complete. Some of the people didn't answer all the questions, especially the ones towards the end. And some of these responses were, well, you know, we are building EA, but we're not really doing it yet. in today's presentation, I'm going to focus on the ones who are actually doing EA because they've had more experience in it. Here's the distribution from the survey. As you can see, there were a small number of countries that were really dominant, 6 of them: UK, Australia, Canada, USA, New Zealand, and Saudi Arabia. My PhD student, Aliaa, is a native Saudi Arabian, and so she was able to conduct interviews in Arabic in Saudi Arabia, but all the rest of them and all the surveys were done in English. So in terms of the types of institutions, 93% were public, 7% being private. And it turns out we're talking essentially universities. We targeted all higher education institutions, but we didn't really get very many of the colleges. So we're talking really universities here. 7% therefore were private, mostly in the United States. 75% of the institutions that we reached were multi-campus. Now, of course, there are many, many, many small single campus universities. It seems that the people who were more interested in the topic and doing EA more tend to be more in the larger multi-campus institutions. And in fact, we reached 27% of all of the universities we talked to are large ones, where we define large as having more than 40,000 students. And in analyzing the data and comparing to the actual number of institutions in the top 6 countries that have more than 40,000 institutions, we reached more than 34%, more than a third of all of them. So many of the very large universities in Canada, the United States, UK, Australia, and so on. Those are the ones who are doing EA and were very interested in talking to us and answering our survey. 64% of these universities have what they would consider a full EA program. They've been doing this job. They call it enterprise architecture. They know what it's all about. 36% have aspects of it. They may not perhaps call it enterprise architecture, but they're doing some of the spectrum of work that, say, would be defined in TOGAF. In particular, it's notable that in Saudi Arabia, 100% of our respondents were doing full enterprise architecture. And as we'll see, that's because it's actually a government requirement. In Saudi Arabia, they're very big in enterprise architecture. Maybe we don't hear about it so much here because, well, most of us don't speak Arabic, but enterprise architecture has a big impact on Saudi Arabia. And so 100% of them are doing full EA. And then it drops down from there. So Canada, we're only about 40%, USA 56%. So Canada universities are doing a little bit less than half what we would call have full EA programs. Quite a few don't. We asked about the deployment trends of enterprise architecture, and 66% of the universities we talked to have increasing effort planned over the coming years. Now, this survey was done in 2019, so we're talking 2020, 2021. Who knows what happened during the pandemic? So this predates the pandemic. 29% are satisfied with their current level of engagement in enterprise architecture, and 6% said that they would be winding it down because they'd had one or more failure cases. And we might talk about those a little bit later on. We'll certainly talk about the success factors. As I said, it's mandated in Saudi Arabia, so they will be either keeping it at current levels or increasing all of it. Now, what about the team structure? The people we spoke to said were part of the enterprise architecture team, which we, by the way, carefully distinguished from the IT team. So EA teams in universities, some of them had very large teams, greater than 6, and medium teams, but the mode and median was 2 or 3, between 2 and 3. That was the number of people who, including the chief enterprise architect and some assistants, people who majority of their work was considered enterprise architecture. And then, of course, there were quite a lot who had either a lone person or even a part-time person, somebody whose job role was something else, but did some enterprise architecture work. In terms of reporting arrangements, 53% of the head of enterprise architecture reported to the CIO, whereas 26% reported to the manager of IT, so underneath the IT function, which we thought was interesting. Just switching to IT for a moment, because it's interesting to see how this works. We asked the question of how centralized the IT function is in the universities. And the yellow is where there is a central IT team, but most IT work is distributed to faculties, colleges, departments, or services. So this is the distributed model of IT. It used to be much more common that a lot of IT was done in departments and faculties. Most universities now do most of their work centrally. And so really, that's the green. Okay, this central IT team does most of the work. And then the blue is where there's a central IT team, but some of the work is distributed. So what is EA? We had to make sure that we were using a common vocabulary when we were talking to people. So one of the things we did was ask them, well, what do you consider EA? And we took definitions from a number of sources, including TOGAF and some of the other standards that are out there, some academic papers. And this came out during the interview process, and we whittled it down to 6 definitions. And we asked it in the survey, well, which definitions do you think apply to you? And as you can see from the columns on the right, most of the definitions apply either strongly or somewhat. Okay, so we can see at the top that the most popular definition that applied to the most people was a process of understanding the different elements that go to make up the enterprise and how these elements are interrelated. So a process of understanding. You know, we're not really talking about digital transformation there, right? It's just the understanding process, the documenting, and so on. Getting a little bit deeper, we have a digital representation. So now we're not talking about the process, but we're talking about the representation. So the architecture as repository, as opposed to the architectural process. The third was a formal description of the current and future state and managed change. And now we're getting into digital transformation between the states. The fourth one was now getting into strategy, strategic information base, defining mission and information, along with the technologies and the transitional processes, implementing response to the changing mission. So that's really where we're getting into digital transformation. And you will notice that, 60% said it somewhat applies, 18% strongly applies. So that implies we're getting on to 80% of people who kind of get that this digital transformation thing is real in their organizations. There were a couple of others, a master plan and a discipline, but you get the idea. These definitions cover the spectrum, but most of the enterprise architects feel that they kind of all apply to some extent. So why are people doing EA? Well, a lot of popular reasons. You'll notice that we've color-coded this chart. So the dark orange is absolutely essential. That is the absolutely essential motivation, and yellow is very important. And between absolutely essential and yellow, we're covering most of the spectrum here. So there's only a very few who would say not important at all, 4 to 6%, 4 to 6% for all of these. So, motivations included, and almost equally, aligning projects with organizational goals, aligning business function with the IT function, reducing duplication, enabling digital transformation. There we go. That's the raison d'etre of this conference. Very high perspective there, 60%. And then dropping down a little bit in motivations 5 to 9. These are ordered from most motivating to somewhat less important as a motivator. So leveraging assets effectively, enabling adaptability to new corporate goals, new opportunities, data-driven decision-making, reducing overall institutional costs, and finally, mandated by the government. Now, of course, we hope that even in Saudi Arabia, where it is mandated by the government, that some of the other motivations were also present, and indeed they were, right? But 61% said it's not important at all that it's mandated by the government because it isn't in most places. But it's pretty much mandated also to some extent in a number of other countries that we talked about. Certainly highly encouraged by government in Australia and New Zealand, for example. So what frameworks were used? Well, TOGAF is the standard. And again, if you look at this, the red is they follow it closely, right? The orange is we've adapted it. So you'll notice that relatively few people follow TOGAF closely, but considerable number have adapted it. And then the greenish orange have borrowed elements from it, and the dark green is somewhat influenced by it, and the light blue is discovered that we are aligned with it somewhat. So they've kind of stumbled on doing an enterprise architecture in the TOGAF way, and then realized when they took the course probably that, oh yeah, we're doing this stuff. Do not use is the gray, and then never heard of it, which is a little bit surprising if you actually call yourself an enterprise architect, is the very light gray, right? So that's TOGAF. Then we move down to some others. So Gartner has an enterprise architecture approach, and you can see it's not that far off from TOGAF, but clearly do not use it is higher. Then we have the Australia, New Zealand CODIT approach, where now we have follow it closely. And this follow it closely is essentially the cadre from Australia and New Zealand, right? They are all aligned, they talk to each other, and they follow that process closely in that. That doesn't mean they don't also follow TOGAF, because there are high alignments between them. Zachman framework, original, framework, is adapted and so on. Then we have a few others. Itana, Nora, which is this Saudi Arabian approach. Okay, so, here we have follow it closely by the Saudi contingent, of course, have adapted it. I think probably that's one of the Saudis as well. And then we have borrowed elements and somewhat influenced by it from some other countries. And then there are a couple of other approaches. KPMG has done consulting with quite a few universities, certainly University of Ottawa. Our own EA approach was influenced by consultation from KPMG. And this turned out to be the case in quite a few of the higher educational institutions too. So why do people choose these particular frameworks? Well, as I said, some of them are national standards, the CODIT and the NORA from Saudi Arabia. Now, among those who adopted the framework, so this is now excluding those who didn't. So those who did adopt a given framework, we asked, well, why? Well, among those who adopted CODIT, it's because 63% say it aligns well with the university functions and challenges, and 16% say TOGAF does. So CODIT is specifically focused on and tailored to this particular group. TOGAF is a bit more general. People said TOGAF does indeed help guide those who adopted it, the choice of IT and business solutions, followed by Gartner, which also does that. TOGAF is good for guiding, organizing the team. This is 44%, so that's strong, perceived strong area of TOGAF. Gartner follows. Complements other frameworks, so they use some other framework more, like CODIT or NORA, but it complements them. So here we see TOGAF, Zachman, and CODIT coming in. And people said that, well, we like TOGAF because it's very general, okay? TOGAF is considered very complete. None of the others are so much. Managing risks, that's the strength of TOGAF, required to use it. Well, for those who adopt NORA, it's because they're required to use it. Nobody who really adopted it who isn't part of the Saudi culture. And a few people said, well, it was chosen by the predecessor. I really don't know why it was chosen, but it was, and that's what we're doing. So turns out that a lot of the originators of EA start with TOGAF, or a few start with KPMG. But these are the ones who say motivation was because it was chosen by predecessor. Okay, now we asked people, well, what models are you maintaining? And again, we're ranking these, all of these charts that you're seeing are ranked from the most important to the least important. So the model that is used most is application model. So modeling the kinds of either cloud-based or installation-based or installed on the mainframes or whatever it might be of applications, managing those and modeling how those are managed. that was the dominant. And you'll notice here we see 16% extensively, 41% a lot, 25% moderately, and 14% somewhat, but only 4% not at all. Behind that, we have capability models, then data models, all very strong. Service and interface models. So how do the various components, whether they be data provision services, interface with other services and other models and other technologies. Then we have business process models. So we're not talking now about IT or data, we're talking about business processes. Then continuing on down the line, we have security models. That came in a little bit down, which was a little bit surprising to me because the importance of security, I suspect that that might be increasing in time. But people, maybe some organizations put the security function externally. They didn't really consider it part of EA, and that probably explains it. But we did run into universities where security was the thing. I remember in the interviews, we talked to one person who was the chief security and enterprise architect, all rolled into one. So clearly security model was their dominant thing, above all the others. Modeling the enterprise as a whole, modeling networking in the enterprise, modeling the hardware that's being deployed throughout the enterprise, and organization charts. So some other examples of models that were being maintained using various tools by enterprise architects. So speaking of tools, what tools did they use? And in our very early interviews, this came out, and it played out again throughout the interview processes and throughout the survey as well. The number one tool for modeling all of these models in enterprise architecture is spreadsheets. Microsoft Excel principally. Some people use other spreadsheets, but we're talking spreadsheets. 49% use spreadsheets extensively in their modeling, 34% moderately, 16% a little, and only 1% do not use spreadsheets in their modeling. We thought that was quite interesting, given the fact that this is super complex data, potentially at least, if the job's done well, and spreadsheets are really good for some subcategory of that, but not necessarily for everything. Then the next shocker was that presentation tools, and again, principally Microsoft PowerPoint, was a dominant modeling tool. People drawing pictures in PowerPoint to model their organization. You can imagine the obstacles this raises when things change, right? You got to go into your PowerPoint presentations and update them. Word processors, same thing. And then generic drawing tools, Visio and things like that. These four classes of tools dominated. And then we drop off a cliff to other tools that are out there. And we actually had a very large list of tools that we asked about. Archimate was really the only tool that had significant uptake, but it was only at 40%, with only 13% using it extensively and another 13 moderately. So we're talking about a little bit over a quarter of the enterprise architecture teams in higher education seem to be using Archimate. I guess that's probably good, except that you would hope there might be competition for that, and there isn't. I mean, other business modeling tools. So a number of tools for modeling business processes were used, but look at the 83%, don't use it. Data management tools, and then we picked a few, Biz Design Enterprise, Enterprise Architect, which is actually more of a software modeling tool used by a smattering, okay? So very little. And it went down from there. So we asked them, after finding this out in the interviews, well, why do you like these tools so much, the ones that you chose to use? And the dominant answer was, we use tools that are easy to use, right? And the color coding here also corresponds to the type of tool. So the easy to use was by most, and particularly the generic drawing and diagramming tools in the green, the spreadsheets in the blue, text editors in the yellow, and then other tools following that, right? So people just like to draw their models and like to manage their architecture in tools that are easy to use. Cost effective was next. They don't want to spend, $1,000 per seat platforms very much. We'll talk later about how, essentially getting management buy-in is important. And I suppose that if they started off without management buy-in, they had to be pretty careful about what they spent money on. I don't know, but cost effectiveness, even in quite large institutions, was a very dominant thing in terms of tool choice. And then they wanted tools that facilitate collaboration, cross-platforms, so that they have heterogeneous platforms, Windows, Mac mostly, produces good models, right? They want to be able to have their models that be expressive and so on. So that was what they like about it. What didn't they like about the current tools? Okay, and hard to keep up to date. Yeah, so if you've got a bunch of directories with Excel spreadsheets and drawing tools, it's really hard to keep them up to date as the data changes. How do you populate that? It's a manual process mostly. So these two things, keeping up to date and no automated population, very problematic. And not integrated with each other and with other data sources, databases in the institution, no central repository for the enterprise architecture kept on individual computers, things like that, right? These were the dominant problems. So basically, this needs to inform the developers of enterprise architecture tools. There's a big market for doing a heck of a lot better job. Make sure you keep it easy to use, okay, as easy to use as Office tools, but make it easy for automated population of data. So that's the mandate for tool developers. Okay, so moving on then, we asked people, what are the key principles that you consider important in enterprise architecture? Now, of course, there are lots of principles outlined in the standards like TOGAF and others, but we asked people to rank them. And so what you see here is rank ordered. And this is not which ones are good, it's which ones have you actually adopted in your organization, right? So the orange this is similar to one of our organization's formal EA principles. Yellow is important, but informally applied. Blue considered sometimes, right? So essentially the most important principle of the general principles, and we'll talk about other categories, data principles and technology principles in separate slides. But among the general principles, aligning the decisions and the architecture with the strategic mission, vision, and values of the university. That is the key principle which guides their work in enterprise architecture. Closely followed by maximizing benefits to the institution as a whole, ensuring compliance with various laws, standards, and policies, and then digital integration. So that's the digital transformation thing. But you'll notice quite a few of these were high. Most of these principles were considered pretty good, pretty widely adopted. There were a few others, and it's probably interesting, rather than looking at all of them, but just to look at a few. So agility, this is the second tranche, right? We're about halfway through, and we see be agile was a principle that 32% said, yeah, we have a formal principle to be agile. Informally, another 34%, so that's about 2/3. And then, another third considered sometimes. But nobody says, at least, that they're not agile or not trying to be, right? 1% only. Let's jump down to the bottom of this, okay? So at the bottom, we have some of the principles that seem to be a little bit less important. And it's interesting to see that ensuring elements of the architecture are measurable was at the bottom. Yeah, still, some people consider it essential, but many people don't. And, it's interesting to note when I've been working with organizations and trying to help them, for example, define, key performance indicators, I always have to remind people, you got to be able to measure this thing. It's got to have a real measurable meaning in practice, right? So I think that's something that a little bit more emphasis needs to be put on. Another one which was a little bit low, and perhaps surprisingly low, was single federated enterprise-wide architecture. What's going on here is that we see quite a few of these organizations have sort of silos of enterprise architecture that's distributed among, you might have an enterprise architecture in a faculty somewhere or in a unit somewhere, or that just focuses on the IT team but doesn't really care so much about the broader enterprise and other things that go on. By the way, this entire set of slides will be available. And also at the end of this slide deck, there will be links to a lot of raw data. So you can download a lot more information as well. All right, let's move on to data management principles, second category. So, and I have 8 principles here. The top 4, data is kept secure. So security of data really dominated there. Similar to one of the organization's formal principles, right up there. So yes, that seems to be consistent with what a lot of people think about. Data is an asset second. Data is accessible, available. In other words, different organizational units can use the data to leverage it. And data that is gathered is shared, which is closely related to that. All high, but dropping off, you'll notice. The second tranche of data principles include reuse. There are policies, and then data is under the control of a trustee. That was talked about a little bit in this conference this morning, right? So a few, something on the order of 15%, don't have a trustee, and something on the order of about 40% actually have a formal principle of trusteeship of data. And then at the bottom, common vocabulary. So we're talking data dictionaries and other ways of describing data in metadata. It's an important principle, but it's not, it's the bottom of the 8. Finally, moving on to technology management principles. And again, rank ordered. So the top 6 on this slide. Now, many of the EA standards have separate technology principles and application principles. And in our interviews, we came to realize that that might be outdated. Partly due to the advent of the cloud. It's very difficult to distinguish your cloud-based applications from your cloud-based technology. And so we decided, after analyzing the interview data, to basically blend together technology principles and application principles. Many of them strongly overlap. So the top one of the technology principles that came out was ensure interoperability of technological components, right? So half of them said, yeah, this is pretty formal. Whether they be applications that interchange data, or at the back end, the data is interchanged through some kind of data infrastructure. Moving down, compliance with standards, ease of use of technology was third, still pretty high, and helping users perform their work efficiency, but dropping, high but dropping now, going on down. Control technical diversity, not having too many different databases, too many different platforms, and buying instead of building, right? But, you know, important, but dropping down. Continuing to drop down, and let's go to the bottom of the list, the second tranche of these technology management principles, prefer open solutions, right? So some of them say, no way, we will not prefer open source. We're going to go with the commercial software, the commercial products. And indeed, that one does show up elsewhere in this list. This second to last, align with multiple products from a single vendor to best leverage that vendor's ecosystem. So there was some interplay between organizations that did the one or did the other, right? Some of them were really, we're going to use Linux and we're going to use everything open. So we aren't bound to the vagaries of one particular vendor. Others will go all in on Microsoft or all in on Google, right? Or all in on whatever vendor they want. Avoid vendor lock-in was also near the bottom, right? So many of them were concerned about this, but it wasn't really dominant. It's considered sometimes, or not at all, was getting on for half there. Okay, this little chart talks about how these principles affect the flexibility of the organization. And some of them felt that the principles that they had articulated in their enterprise architecture plan reduced their flexibility. That's the blue. And some of them, the orange and yellow, feel that these principles, in fact, are aiding flexibility, right? Interesting to see that. There's quite a bit of difference of opinion in that perspective. So what factors govern success of the overall enterprise architecture process? Again, 2 tranches of these. The top one by far, support of the university's mission and goals. Okay, if they support the university's mission and goals, that is going to help, universally. It's not considered irrelevant by any of them. That is going not even unimportant. It's either moderately important, very important, or critical. Okay, so that's considered as key success factor. Second, having top management support. And we talked to organizations that did not have top management support for enterprise architecture, including some of the organizations that said, you know what, we're going to be winding this down. Top management doesn't get it, right? So you got to keep your top management motivated and appreciating what's going on. Otherwise, some of them, new president comes in, new vice president comes in, which is a routine thing, of course, and your EA could be in trouble. Adding value to the institution was ranked third. I'm not going to focus on the others because we have a lot of things to talk about. Let's look at the bottom though, okay? At the bottom of this list, which you see down here underlined in red, are success factors that were considered quite a bit lower. So conformance of the architecture to standards was considered not to be a driver of success, certainly behind the others. Few, 7 or 8% considered it critical, but most didn't. And then following a disciplined EA process. This was a theme that we saw repeated. EA is a more holistic process, driven in a more agile way, changing as needs changed and new ideas came up, as opposed to being very rigid. Rigidity was not something that seemed to give a lot of success in the EA. Next thing was you want to hire the right people, right, to do EA. So what would be considered success factors in getting the right people in? And well, the first few are sort of motherhood and apple pie, right? Having good interpersonal skills, communicating well, and adapting to change. Your EA people need to do that. They were either critical, very important, pretty much, along with a few others. Ability to adapt to change was up there, and then it dropped off a little bit after that. But let's look at the bottom ones. Take a look at the bottom of this. So having a deep knowledge of higher education in general was not considered critical. And in fact, it was not even considered important. We saw this theme play out over and over again. So in other words, when you're hiring people to be enterprise architects, you can get them from other fields of domain. So hiring somebody in from banking into higher education could work, right? And then having a high level of education and training in EA itself didn't seem to be critical, because you can train them up when you get them in. If they have other educational backgrounds, whether it be IT or general management or whatever, you can train them. You can send them off on the TOGAF course and other courses and train them on the job. That seemed to be something that was considered quite fine. It wasn't a problem to hire people who didn't have EA background as part of your EA team. And finally, you don't have to hire from within. So you don't have to hire people who have a background in your particular institution. That was considered critical by a teeny percentage, and most said absolutely not important. Bring people in from outside, feel free. So what were the challenges posed to enterprise architecture? And again, I'm going to just highlight a few here. The biggest challenge was resistance to change. Okay, more than half of the enterprise architects said this was a challenge to their work, i.e. people having fixed mindsets and habits and not willing to change. Another challenge was lack of awareness among the university leadership. This ties back to getting top management buy-in to your enterprise architecture processes. And the third biggest challenge was different perspectives and opinions, different stakeholders pushing for different things and causing conflict and not allowing you to achieve enterprise architecture or digital transformation goals. So those are the things that need to be worked on. There were many others, but I do want to move on and just show you a few of the others that we looked at. So for example, looking down at the bottom, we see lack of leadership skills was sometimes a problem, but not too much, didn't seem to show up. I guess they hire the right people. And lack of linkages among different types of EA information. Well, that was interesting because we did see this as a problem in terms of your silo spreadsheets and drawing tools that didn't link together. But this didn't seem to be a massive challenge when it came to actually success of the overall program. So they were doing reasonably well despite having tools that were inadequate. Maybe they could do better with better tools, but it wasn't hindering them that much. And continuing to move down the list, excessive centralization wasn't important. Lack of higher education experience by the leadership wasn't so problematic. Focusing too much on business and not on IT was also not problematic. Okay, so these are some of the lower things. So in their EA programs, what impact did they have? Okay, so they felt that they had the biggest impact on alignment of IT and the university's mission. So really helping align those. And now that scale here is red is very positive impact and green is very negative impact, right? So in the middle, we have no impact at all, which is this light gray, right? So when you see the light green, we see that there was a negative impact of one or two organizations on the alignment of IT strategies with the mission. A little bit odd. Security, none of them had a negative impact. Some of them didn't have any impact, but many programs, there was a decent impact of EA on security, also on purchasing and so on. Bottom areas, again, we don't see too much negative impact, but purchasing of assets other than software, there wasn't much impact on that. And there wasn't much impact on job satisfaction of university employees. So maybe that's an area where it could be some improvement. You know, if you can impact job satisfaction, you might get better buy-in, right? What did these EA teams do after the establishment of their program to really evolve their enterprise architecture? The prominent changes that they made as an EA team to build out their EA processes. You see a few things here. Enterprise thinking was really dominant. And we had a definition of what enterprise thinking was. 70.77% said this was something that they really push on. Sharing information across different systems, 56%, increasingly informing decision-making for technology and business, 52%. And then finally, setting up an architecture board was another important thing that a lot of them did, right? We saw this. This was a big trend. You have an architecture board that brings in stakeholders, including people who are not enterprise architects, not even IT people, but a wide variety of stakeholders who can help make some decisions about the enterprise architecture and be informed about it. Very important thing to do. The final major category I'm going to talk about is agility, right? So we wanted to look into agility because we saw that being flexible was quite important and that some organizations felt that they weren't very flexible. So, well, what percentage of organizations felt they were flexible? Agile. Between moderately, very, and extremely, you know, we're talking well over 70%. Slightly, we're talking something on the order of 28%, and not agile at all, less than 10%. So that's actually quite good. Okay, moderately agile, most of these organizations at the current time. What influenced and helped them be agile? Well, the philosophy of just enough architecture, trying not to document everything, was key. Making sure that you have enough resources and models that you can actually use it, as opposed to trying to have this massive architecture that falls into disrepair. The second thing was agile software development. Of course, we're not talking about IT teams here overall, but when the EA people interacted with IT, if they would promote agile development, that was considered a positive influence on the overall EA of the organization. Using the frameworks as a guide only, as opposed to being rigidly adhering to them, was also considered important. And then a few others, responding quickly to business, were also considered there. And then there's a few that were considered not something that drives agility. So small teams, you know, that it wasn't critical to have a small team. You could still be agile with a larger team. Careful planning maybe can detract from agility as well. So the most negative influences on EA agility, and we can go from down at the bottom here to think of what was the most negative, was too many applications and technologies. Organizations that have vast inventories of applications, technologies, found it very hard to be agile. That stands to reason. It makes a lot of sense, but it's something we have to think about, right? Resistance to change pops up again. Very large organizations, harder to be agile. And then too many initiatives and projects was another one that tended to have an influence negatively. So I'm going to wrap up now with a few slides of conclusions very quickly. Okay, so EA is widely used in higher education, especially in large institutions and in certain countries, particularly Saudi Arabia, Australia, New Zealand, very dominant, but also there are many institutions throughout North America and Europe using it. We noticed that EAs are seeking frameworks that align with the particular domain, higher education. And they're motivated by alignment of business and IT, digital transformation, great, and reducing duplication. Those are dominant motivations. Key models are the ones we saw earlier: application capability, data, and business process. And ideal tools do not exist. In other words, we need tools that are better, tools that integrate better, easier to use. It may be that there are tools that are too expensive or tools that just have not been promoted well enough. We also find that there is consistent agreement about the key principles. So whatever you see in the standards like TOGAF, yeah, indeed, they are good principles. We decided, and we found it was best to divide them into 3 groups. And so maybe going forward, the standards should say general principles, data principles, and technology principles. We also said that key success factors are supporting organizations' missions and goals, ensuring management support, and don't be too stuck on disciplined formal processes. Key success factors in hiring, interpersonal skills, but it's less important to have formal knowledge of either EA, higher education, or the local institution. And finally, to have impact, okay? You want to push for enterprise thinking. You want to push for addressing resistance to change. How can we deal with that? You know, we need, that's central and key. It pops up in many places. You need to raise awareness of EA among different categories of stakeholders, all the way down to your individual, vice deans and professors and IT employees. Understand divergent perspectives. People have different perspectives, got to deal with those, and be more agile. Do that, just enough architecture, respond quickly to stakeholders. Some data sets are online. You'll get these slides, so you can click on the links there. The summary of all this data we saw is available at this particular bit.ly link. You want to write it down while I leave it up. The actual thesis, search for Aliaa Alghamdi, her thesis, or come to my website, you'll find it linked there. And then we also published a paper on some of this at a scientific conference in 2019. Ready for questions?
Okay, thank you very much, Tim. That was a great presentation. The first question that we have is on EA tool usage. And I just want to clarify one thing. Archimate is a language, not a tool.
As opposed to Archie, yes.
Right. Yeah, and Archimate's implemented in numerous tools. So I just want to clarify, Archie is the tool, you're right.
We were really meaning, Archimate-based tools. Right, yeah.
Okay, sorry. But like things have evolved over the last 2 years since then. But anyways, on EA tool usage, give some EA teams report to business and not IT. What solutions are you aware of to address issues where EA wants to use more technical tools and notation, but still engage business in EA, especially people that can't follow a formalism such as Archimate, sorry.
Right, yeah. I mean, That's a very good question. And really the ideal tool support would allow you to use a formal notation, but at the same time automatically generate visuals that would be dynamically updated for stakeholders who aren't technical. I mean, you know, that's what's needed in tool suites, I would say. The reason why they're using Excel and PowerPoint and so on is because it's accessible, and they can draw pictures and connect the pictures to data, but they then have the problem of keeping them up to date.
And just for the audience's appreciation, there are departments in the Canadian government where the business people use a subset of Archimate very successfully, and they've mastered that in the business architectures. So right. Just, it's not mutually exclusive. A lot of business people are open to learning Archimate for that. But next question is a really good one. You know, how do you define a full EA program?
Right. So we asked people to select their definitions and then to say, to what extent do you believe that you are doing to a full extent what is specified in the standard you've adopted. You know, it was clear that some people were just picking and choosing very small pieces of the enterprise architecture puzzle. Maybe they were just managing applications, a suite of applications, for example, and they weren't really looking at data, or they were focusing only on security. So are you doing multiple sets of models? Are you following most of the principles and trying to be holistic as opposed to really being siloed into one particular narrow branch?
Are there any other questions right now that the audience might have? Okay. Well, thank you very much for the presentation, Dr. Lethbridge. That was great. I really appreciated that. And what happens is we'll be posting these. You'll get instructions on Cvent and probably through Eventbrite on where you can pick up the presentation as well as the references that were included in that. So this concludes this particular session. The next one's going to be given by Dr. Liam Payton, who's head of graduate studies in the engineering faculty at the University of Ottawa, and he's started the digital transformation and innovation program at the university, as well as many other micro programs he will describe to you in quite some detail that are relevant to digital transformation. So lacking any further questions, thank you very much. So I'd recommend now that you take a few moments and then go to join the session for Dr. Payton. Thank you very much, Dr. Lethbridge. That was great.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.